All right, so hello everyone, I'm Lauren Celenza. If you didn't see me earlier, I'm a designer and writer based in the US. I work in the tech field. I also write a lot about technology. And, Daniel, throughout the course of time and the evolution of the stories and formats of modern love, advancements in technology have greatly impacted, needless to say, the way that we interface with love, the way that we perceive love, the way that we acquire love, and even lose it. So I figured for today's conversation, we can have a little twist and have that angle to the questions that we'll be in conversation with today. And specifically, I want to chat about the role of dating apps in connection and intimacy, the future of story curation in the age of AI, and the challenges of authenticity in modern love narratives. So I wanted to start this conversation actually with a question to the audience. How many of you have used a dating app to find love or friendship? Yes, okay, amazing. And with using a dating app, and you've stated this before, Daniel, and past interviews that you've done, that one truth that you've found from doing this column is that love requires vulnerability. And being vulnerable is to have someone truly know you and to know someone else on a deep level. But with that can come a lot of risk and pain and hurt to do so. And it's really fantastic to hear the stories that you all brought forth today and the vulnerability and the courage that you had to tell those stories. And even with a dating app in particular, there's this extra layer of vulnerability because you're likely meeting a total stranger for the first time. So I'd love to ask you, Daniel, as the first question here, through reading and curating the modern love stories, what do you think is the biggest impact that dating apps have had on our perceptions of love?
This is always a really fun subject to talk about. On an anti-technology note, I see people fanning themselves with their badges, which is a really nice. If I do that during this too, that's okay, but feel free. The main change, so I started doing this work almost 20 years ago, and the main change has been the rise of dating apps and social media, neither of which really existed back in 2004. And both of them have overlaps of we're curating ourselves, and we're able to select parts of ourselves that we put forward and parts that we hide. And if the challenge in relationships is letting someone know you for who you really are, not how you want to be known, but who you really are, then there's a downside to dating apps, there's a downside to social media, in that it encourages our impulses to hide our flaws and hide our vulnerability and hide the things about ourselves that we think are unappealing but may be someone else's way into us. And it can leave people less room into us. At the same time, dating apps have changed the world because of the number of people that they open up to you that you would not have met otherwise. And I especially think of people who are LGBTQ in places where that isn't acceptable, or being able to find your community through a dating app or through social media has liberated lives that would have been smothered in so many ways. So none of this stuff is black and white. None of this stuff is all good and all bad. And I think dating apps and social media, they can be leveraged by you in ways that are very powerful. I think the key to them is to use them, is to not rely on them to extend a relationship, but to meet in person. There's no replacement for in-person communication, smells. We don't really talk about. But a lot of attraction is about that pheromone and that way of people. You're with someone who smells a certain way, and it it makes a difference. We're animals, you know. I'm sorry to say it, but we're like, not sorry to say it, actually. We're animals, and there are things that you are drawn to in person that are not meant to be mediated by a screen and by a phone and all of that. So I don't use those tools as a crutch to protect yourself. Use them as a sort of bridge to expose yourself.
A conduit, yes. I like to know the smell of someone before I make a decision to go further in the relationship, for what it's worth. So with that said, you know, living in a time of social media, dating apps, we also live in an incredibly globally dispersed and connected world. I also want to ask another question to the audience. How many of you are currently in a long-distance relationship? And this relationship could be romantic love, or it could be a family member that is long distance. All right, yeah, a lot of us in this room. You know, with the fact that we live in a time where we are in long-distance relationships more than ever before, text-based, voice notes, FaceTime-based formats are becoming sort of the way in which we connect to one another and find love with one another. But when we're connecting through these screens and through these formats, there's inevitably that barrier there. And sometimes it can fool us into thinking that there's real intimacy when really it's that conduit that we talked about. But at the same time, I think that, you know, these formats also challenge us, or being in a long-distance relationship challenges us to rethink or reimagine how to find relatability and intimacy amid these barriers. So, for example, I live far away from my sister. We live on opposite sides of the US. I'm here in Romania, and I'm far away from my life partner, Brian, who's back in Seattle on the other side of the world, and I feel the silence of longing for him right now. So if you're watching, Brian, I love you and I miss you. But you know, I use apps like Marco Polo, FaceTime, voice notes, sometimes as a way to kind of have these like quick sound bites throughout my day to relate to that person that I love, so that even though we're at a distance, we can sort of contact each other and talk about our everyday life, and that helps us to feel like we're actually close. So it's this strange dichotomy, right, of the screens create this barrier, but there's also new ways now that we're able to connect and relate on an everyday level, right? So I would love to hear from you, Daniel. Like, how have you seen the Modern Love stories try to either, you know, address these barriers within the stories, or perhaps discover new ways through technology of finding love and connection across distance?
Well, what I've seen a lot is how sort of an online relationship, whether it's through a phone or a laptop or both, how you can get very deep on a certain level. Like, you can get really deep, very emotionally invested, because the risk of physical intimacy isn't there. And that's that's authentic, that emotional connection. It's real, but it's not complete. It's not complete, but it allows you, that protection of the technology allows you to get very deep, very fast. In a similar way to how I was describing in my own story, that the relationship had an expiration date where we were going to separate, and so the risk level goes down. You don't have to be thinking long term, and you can really get into it in a way that where you kind of feel protected. And I think you have to be cautious and aware of what the technology is enabling. And one story that I always think about that was so well done was a woman as a senior in college, and she met a guy who went to a different college that was a 9-hour drive away. And they met at a conference just briefly, and there was sort of a spark. And then they started communicating in the way that we do, which is texting, and it became constant, and it went from texting, it was a combination of texting and being on, well, Zoom wasn't around then, it was Skype, I guess. It was on Skype, and they were living with each other through Skype. It got to the point where they were like, they'd have their phone and they'd be in bed, like going to sleep and looking at each other on the phone. And they'd wake up and sort of refresh, get the screen back up, and they'd say good morning to each other. And it was intimate. There was an authenticity to it. There was a vulnerability to it, but it wasn't real and it wasn't in person. And finally, she was like, it went on for months. She was like, we have to know if this is viable. We have to know if this is viable, and so can I come visit you? And so she got in a car, she rented a car from her college and drove 9 hours to see him. It was awkward from the start. But the real turning point came when they went out to dinner, and during the dinner, he was on his phone. And he was looking at it, doing whatever, and I think we don't realize the extent to which we have emotional triggers that are attuned to technology. So their relationship had been so intimate, but it came from the phone. It came from her pocket. It didn't come from someone sitting across the table. The phone was the thing. And when you're that triggered by the phone, think of when you're with someone you love and you're texting and you get a text from them. That's coming from the phone is the trigger to that feeling. The person's on the other side of it. But it comes through the phone, and so the phone is the intimacy. And we love our phones, and we massage our phones, and if we lose our phones, we're devastated. And if our screen gets cracked, it's like emotionally wounding and all of that. But it's too much attachment to the phone. And he couldn't get away from that. It was like a fondling kind of thing, where he'd like feel in love if he could be looking at his phone, and their relationship fell apart. And no matter what the intimacy is, you have to be able, and this especially became clear during the pandemic, when all of our relationships became through a screen. And when we started to come out of that, people I work with and friends, we were all a little awkward socially. Like seeing someone in person after the pandemic and socializing and being at a bar, it was all a little like, I remember Saturday Night Live did a hilarious skit about this, where the only conversation people could have was, what vaccine did you get? Like they couldn't like get beyond what vaccine did you get. They were so unsort of practiced in having social interaction. Just like with dating apps and just like with social media, there's a limit to what they can provide, and just be aware of that limit. And I think festivals like this are the antidote to that. It's in person. You talk to people in person. You reveal who you are, and the phones are for knowing what the next event is.
Well said. I mean, yeah, I have my phone right now reading notes, and it's the first thing that I touch every day. I mean, we touch our phones the first part of every morning more than we touch each other.
It's our greatest love affair.
Yeah. So, with that said, technology has changed a lot of behaviors over time, and particularly the way that we digest information as well, with new evidence suggesting, for example, that the way Gen Z digests information is very different from older generations. Our attention spans are evolving. And this makes me think of tiny love stories, because tiny love stories are modern love in miniature form, featuring reader-submitted stories in, I think, no more than 100 words. Right. And so, I'm curious, what was the impetus for creating tiny love stories, and did these technological-driven, behavioral changes play a role in changing the format in more of a miniature, bite-sized way?
Yes, it did, but maybe not in the way you expect. Tiny love stories, so Modern Love column, which are stories that are about 1,500 words long, and the second story that was read during the earlier session was about that long. It's about 5 double-spaced pages. And that's really a full story. You can tell a full arc of a story. And Modern Love is a successful brand at the Times. It sort of expanded in these other ways, and it's a good feature in a newspaper, because the news can become more popular or less popular depending on how much is going on. But it's very important for a media company to have sort of rock solid, evergreen things that are always of interest. So there was a need or pressure on me to create more modern love. And the pressure was actually to create another column that was of a similar length, and I really needed to beat that back because I didn't want to create competition for my own column and dilute the quality of my own column, but I had to answer that pressure. And the inspiration for Tiny Love Stories is actually Twitter, which is no longer Twitter, now it's X and going down the toilet. But Twitter, had 140 characters and then 280 characters, I think. I can't even remember. And it was a very short way to create a narrative, but it could often really pack a punch. It could really pack a punch. And my original inspiration for Tiny Love Stories was to have, it was originally going to be called Tweeted Love Stories. But we couldn't do that because that would give credit to another company. Yeah. So I needed to come up with some other name for it, and my boss said, "Why don't you just call it what it is? It's a tiny love story." And we called it Tiny Love Stories. We made the length arbitrarily 100 words, and they're often sort of like poetry, but they're very much inspired by attention span and being able to communicate something just in very few words and to be able to share it easily.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a bit to a broader question. And I'm going to be vulnerable for a moment and share my own modern love and conflict, because they often come together, which is that, over the last couple of years, I've had some difficult challenges in my relationship with my parents. And oftentimes our love can kind of come into conflict because of political and generational differences. And I'm sure you all in this room can relate to some extent. I'm really excited to be in this period of reunion with my parents, because we are both coming to this unity around the fact that we want love at the end of the day, despite our differences. And I'd love to learn about, what you see the role of modern love playing amid times of polarization.
As a column?
Yeah.
I have that same conflict with my parents.
Yeah.
There's increasing polarization, I think, and I think the media the fracturing of the media has contributed to that, and everybody's looking for their piece of the audience. And for instance, like Fox News, which has become a very powerful force in the United States, like they have identified an audience, and then they want to keep that audience, and it's led. The news used to be sort of a more shared. There were shared beliefs and a shared history, and that's become fractured. I mean, my hope for modern love, and I've seen this happen over and over through the years, is it's easy when there's polarization, there's demonization, and there's demonization of people who you think are unlike you. So these people on the other side of the political divide, people on the other side of the culture wars, people who you think are scary for one reason or another, they undermine your values and you undermine theirs. And it seems like we move off into these like tribal camps.
Yep.
But all of that is based on not knowing each other. All of that is based on knowing what someone believes, but not knowing who they are. And there seem to be increasingly few ways to sort of bridge that. But the power of storytelling, I mean, storytelling has been around since we were like, drawing on the cave walls as a way to learn how to live. It's been the main teacher of how to live. I always think like advice columns are very popular. They're very popular at the New York Times. They're popular everywhere. And I'm not a big advice giver. I don't, someone telling you what to do is almost like a prescription for me of doing the opposite thing. Like, I don't want to be told what to do. A lot of people don't want to be told what to do, but people want to learn what to do from other people's experiences. And what my hope is for modern love, and I've seen this play out again and again, is it's easy to demonize someone based on abstractions, based on the general quality you think someone has because of their life choices. Or groups of people, more importantly, groups of people. That group of people is going to be bad for me and my family. That group of people is going to be bad for me and my family. But individuals can be very empathetic. And to know someone's individual story, you start to see, oh, well, I feel those same things. I feel scared in that way. I've been ostracized in that way. So what Modern Love has done, especially with all the social changes that have taken place, like gay marriage, issues of gender, that have taken place in the last 20 years of the column, it has personalized some of these stories for a very broad audience. So the Modern Love column gets read every week by hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes by millions of people, and sometimes by tens of millions of people. And that's real impact. The podcast gets listened to by 600,000 people around the world every week. The TV show, I don't know. Amazon didn't tell me what the numbers were, but I think Amazon has pretty broad reach, and those shows were seen by tens of millions of people. And when you see one person's story that you can identify with, and maybe that person's like you, it breaks down those barriers, or at least there's the hope that it can. And I've seen that, and I've seen letters that come in to us about that. I've seen it on social media. And I think if there's any hope, that's the only hope, is to be able to have individual stories impact people and change minds, and so that we can sort of progress as one people instead of a bunch of tribes.
Yeah, I love that. To seek the individuality in each of us. That's where we can grasp onto empathy, I think. So I want to switch a little bit into a more practical question. So as an editor for the column, how many stories do you typically read a day?
That has changed enormously over the years. I can read about 150 stories a day, but that is not reading all the stories. The one thing I've gotten good at, and I've had to get good at, and I have one other person who works with me, by the way, who reads ahead of me, and she sort of makes a first cut in most cases. But for maybe a decade, I was the only person, 12 years, I was the only person doing it. And I opened every single email and started reading every single story. And what I got really good at was figuring out very fast who had something to say and who didn't, or who could say something well and who couldn't. And there were just keywords, lazy phrases, an attitude that didn't seem right. To tell a story about yourself and where you've learned something, you have to be pretty humble. You've been humbled by life, but you're also wise. And that comes through very quickly. If someone's feeling sort of high on themselves at the beginning of a story, you know that they don't know what they're talking about, in a way. What's changed more in recent years is, and this just has to do with how media gets consumed, which is all online pretty much these days. So a headline for a story, I mean, you'd think of it as a title, but we still call them headlines, that's on an essay, will determine whether that story is read or not by most of the people. So we spend a lot of time figuring out what a headline is that people will click on, and it can't be disappointing. It can't be clickbait. It can't be something that's all tantalizing and then doesn't deliver. So it's really hard to find the words to have something that is tantalizing but also true and delivers and doesn't tell the whole story in advance. And what I've seen is that as we've evolved with headlines and tempting readers that way, writers writing to us have evolved in the same way in how they pitch their stories to us. And they've realized the importance of being able to capture their story in a few words. And more times than you would imagine, I know I'm going to accept a story based on what they put in their subject line of their email. And an example of that is a woman wrote a story where the title she put on it and the words she put in the subject line of her email were, "Please, Lord, let him be 27." And I knew what that story was going to be before I read it, and I was just hoping it would deliver. And it was a 37-year-old woman who had a crush on a younger guy, and she thought 10 years younger would be acceptable. Any younger than that would be too hard. So she was thinking to herself, please, Lord, let him be 27. And he wasn't 27, he was 24.
Oh.
They still fell in love, got married, had children, and the whole thing. But it was a wonderful essay, and it completely delivered on the promise. But I knew, like with 99% certainty after reading that subject line, that I was going to accept that story, and it was just hoping that I could.
I love that, because as a writer myself, too, I'm always thinking of like, what is the heart of this story? What is
Right.
the core? What is that the core emotion that I'm thinking about if I'm writing like a personal narrative? And that strikes me. That's it.
Yeah.
Like that's the core
and if
emotion.
you don't know that, you're really not ready to submit it. Like if you don't,
That's right.
if you can't pitch your story in that way, you probably don't. You're probably not at the point where you should send it in.
Wow. So, the age of AI, artificial intelligence, is certainly raising questions around the future of story curation, writing, the value of human writing, how things get edited, how things get selected. I'm curious, like, how do you search for authenticity in submitted stories and ensure that people, aren't submitting stories that may be dishonest or written heavily by bots and not being transparent about that up front?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that people are writing stories with bots.
ChatGPT, anyone?
I mean, I have a pretty rigorous process. I talk to the writer. I talk to other people in the stories. I research things. Like, we have to be really careful. We can't be pranked. We can't, sometimes writers won't know things. We have to check claims they're making about certain things. So we don't make mistakes very often, and put a lot of time into that checking process and vetting things. In terms of, it's an interesting problem for professors with students writing papers and all of that too. Things being created by bots. You and I, Lauren, were talking about this earlier with where AI seems to be right now. It's aggregating what's on the internet and coming up with a guess as to what you want it to say, and in a way, like, there aren't very many good writers out there. All the information on the internet is not really that well written. Dating profiles are more bland than they are interesting generally. People grab for stock phrases to describe themselves that don't sell themselves very well. They say, like, I like nature, and I like taking walks, and I like,
Walks on the beach.
I like someone who's attractive. I like someone who can have a good conversation. Like, it's not getting into the nitty-gritty of who people are and what they want. It's not that we're lazy about it. It's that we don't really have, we're not very talented. There are very few people who are talented to be able to present themselves in interesting ways. Which means all the data, if you're asking the AI to create a dating profile for yourself, it's going to go out there and grab all that bland stuff and package it in something for yourself. The same is true with it writing essays. It's good for, I think at this point, it may get better. At this point, it's good for research. It's good for filling in things. But I think it's having a really hard time being special. It's having a really hard time creating art that doesn't look like paint by numbers. It's not that good at it yet. And the scary thing is it probably will get good at that. But right now, it's repackaging, from what I've seen, it's sort of repackaging blandness. And as long as we keep pumping out blandness, AI is going to be limited by blandness. But I don't, yeah, there are other bots out there that are determined if something's written by a bot, that can find existing language, and I guess that's the new technology, is determining a bot catching other bots. But I have faith in human beings as being individuals, some of whom have writing talent that is not replicable and that has a magic to it that can't be produced by a machine. And I think that, and a vulnerability that can't be emulated by a machine. And my hope is that that will always be true.
I feel the same.
I feel like 95% hopeful that that will actually be true.
In terms of story curation, I don't want to theorize too much about the future of AI or the hype around it, but where would you want AI to help in terms of the efficiency of that process, and where would you want AI to not be a part of the curation process of stories?
God, I have not thought about that question at all, but I imagine that AI could be really good at being a first reader for a column like this, where it gets 12 or 15,000, 10,000, I don't even know what the number is, every year. They pour in, they pour in every day, and I can't possibly keep up with it. I have all these different responsibilities, and to have a bot that could that could know what a certain level is, that I wouldn't have to pay any attention to. At the same time, I'd be a little sad. Like, I've discovered lots of stories, and I've done a lot of work on stories that needed it, that were really important stories, that even my first reader has dismissed. So I'd still want to have that choice. I don't have time to have that choice, is the thing I keep bumping up against. But some of the stories I'm most proud of are, I think, stories that most people would have rejected, but that really had something powerful in them that could be brought out through an editorial process.
Yeah. I think it's important to sort of stay in tune with whether it's a human or AI curating it. What are the principles?
To
what
stay
are the
involved
guardrails?
and to stay close to it. Yeah.
So I want to ask one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience for a couple of Q&A questions. We are fast approaching the 20-year anniversary of the Modern Love column next year in 2024, which is quite remarkable. What are you most proud about with the Modern Love column? And what about Modern Love is still left unfinished?
I am most proud of upsetting a lot of people. I think the Modern Love audience has changed a lot. I mean, the New York Times audience has changed a lot over the years. But the kind of material I was running early on was really shocking to a lot of people. And we got a lot of mail saying, like, this is not okay. This is not what I want to read in the newspaper. And they were just stories about people's lives that they found objectionable. And there can be a lot of pressure to succumb to that audience, those audience sort of wishes to, like, I want my life reflected. That's basically what they're saying. Like, I want my life reflected, not that life. And the early years of the column, I now work in the Times building, and I have for the past 8 years. But when I started, for the first 12 years, I worked outside of the building in Massachusetts and did the work remotely and would go down a lot. And that saved me in a lot of ways, because when you're in a place that needs to not make mistakes, and it can be harder to take risks. And I was a little bit removed from that. I would publish this stuff. Frankly, the people at the Times were like, what is this guy doing? What are these stories that he's publishing? And they were popular, so they couldn't really complain about that. But they were generating a lot of upset readers who were used to having their lives reflected back to them and have their lifestyle affirmed to them. And I'm not someone who really upsets the apple cart in life. I don't think of myself that way. But I was. And I started to sort of get off on it a little bit. And I kind of liked the fact that these people were all being agitated out of their comfort zones. And that's become harder because the audience has become more diverse and broad and global. But I still do it. And today's story, the one that comes out tomorrow and came out online yesterday, is doing just that. And it's a story about a woman. We're getting all kinds of hate mail for it already. There's a woman who married and fell in love with a professor who is 34 years older than her. So when she's 45, he's 79. They have grown children. And their romantic relationship had long ended, and he they came to an understanding that she would be allowed to have a sexual life outside of this primary relationship. And they sort of waded into that. They talked their way through it. They sort of waded into it. If you want to read it, I don't want to give too much away. But it was even just that part of it was scandalizing enough. And the main thread of complaint coming in about that piece so far has been, you stand by your people. You don't. Couldn't you have waited another 10 years, another 15 years until he died before doing this? But they had agreed about it. He understood. But those are so threatening. Those ideas are so threatening to people. And it's not to say that everyone can do that or everyone believes that. But to me, it's always refreshing to have people trying like this. I'm unhappy, like this isn't quite working, but I love you and I want us to continue our relationship. But I'm 45. Do I want to wait until I'm 60 to have sex again for the first time? And I think it's sort of a magic when you can get people to on board, and where love can sort of overcome those kinds of restrictions. And but those are threatening ideas to a lot of people, and it's threatening to beliefs. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to live that way, and I couldn't live that way necessarily, but it's an idea. It's a perspective, and I'm intensely curious about how people live their lives. It's not fun to see people being evil to other people. There's plenty of that. But when people are being loving to other people, who are we to judge?
Yeah, who are we to judge? All right, so let's open it up to the audience if you have questions. We have time for probably about 2 questions. So yes, can we get a mic up over here?
I'm sorry in advance for this question that I have to ask. What about hate?
What about
hate?
Hate.
Yeah. Do you have experience of it? Do you have an understanding about it? I think hate, it is also, and it can be a very strong emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And it can sometimes, unfortunately, be an engine in the procession of history. So, yes, love is all we need. And what about hate? Thank you.
Yeah, this reminds me of the polarization aspect,
Yes.
love and hate. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
hate is also human, and I think we tend to be scared, of course. I don't know how much are we willing to understand hate.
Yeah. I mean,
That's why I'm asking this question. Thank you.
hate is. I think the history of hate is through dehumanization of people. I think it's. I think hate can come from how we were treated as children and as babies, and I think if there's a lack of love in how you're raised, that can lead to that. But I think the history of hate and the history of demonization is through dehumanization of others. And I'm sure that will always be true. I'm sure we'll never be rid of that. I think the only antidote to that is humanization of other people. And the way to that is through individual storytelling. Like I said earlier, I think it's very hard. There was such a moving moment in the movie about World War I. Was it All Quiet on the Western Front, if anyone saw that? Such a brutal, brutal war and movie. And it follows this one soldier. I hope it's All Quiet on the Western Front, because I saw 2 World War I movies relatively close together. But this scene, it doesn't matter. This scene was this soldier, young kid, 18, whatever, was just brutalized, surviving the war, but brutalized in this trench warfare. And he comes upon, he finds himself sort of in a crater, a muddy crater, shit, and just all the worst of everything, and injured, and with a soldier from the opposing army, and another kid, 18, 19, whatever. And they get into a fight, just a physical fight. He stabs him, and the kid is sort of gurgling up blood. And then he, the one who stabbed him, starts trying to save him. He opens up his jacket and finds his wallet with pictures of his family, and sees mementos of his life. He's a real person. He didn't want to die in this crater. And he starts to try to save him. And oh my God, this scene is just so brutal and glorious. Like this transformation that happens in an instant from enemy to just a human being who wants to go back to his family. He can't save him, of course. He's just killed him. He's stabbed him a bunch of times. But that's the moment, and that's the trigger, and that's the antidote. It's that, like, this is a human being. This is someone who feels love for people, who is wearing a different uniform than I am, and that's the only reason. And he was going to kill me, and I was going to. And those are set in motion by forces that neither of them could control. But it was just such a beautiful moment of I don't know what it would lead to. It wasn't healing necessarily, but it was glorious. Yeah.
This reminds me too of the fact that we were talking about how our phones can trigger emotions within us, right? And what if we all took a moment more throughout the day to pause when we feel that emotion of anger or rage towards a particular group or person, to seek out the individuality of that story, the individual, and what they've gone through in that experience. And I think that is sort of where our humanity comes from, right? And that's how we exist with technology and with apps that might trigger us on some occasions. So let's have one more question. Yes? Yeah?
In all those 20 years, have you...
Oh.
In all those 20 years, have you ever got a love story that was about you or because of you?
Oh, what a question. Yes.
And if yes, if you can share it, please say yes.
You mean just a submitted story that was about me?
Or because of you. Depends.
Oh, I wish I could remember it. I haven't gotten one that was about me, but I've heard stories where I was responsible for the people meeting through by publishing their story and having. I wish I could remember the specifics, but that's happened a lot of times, where someone has published a story. And someone else identified them as having published that story, and that led to a relationship. I think what I'm most responsible for, the most popular essay and sidebar that we ever ran was back in 2015, when we ran an essay called "To Fall in Love with Anyone, Do This." And it was about a woman who'd read about this study. There was sort of an obscure study that psychologists had done in the 90s, if you could help people, strangers, fall in love by asking each other this set of 36 questions. And no one really knew about the study. And she wrote an essay where she got together with an acquaintance, not a stranger, but an acquaintance, and they read those questions to each other at a bar one night, and ended up with them falling in love, not immediately, but over time. And but the thing that I did, which was kind of a last-minute thing, honestly, was adding those questions as a sidebar to the column. And those questions, it's called the 36 Questions to Fall in Love, I think, is one of the most read articles ever to appear in the New York Times, and continues to be year after year after year, and has fostered all kinds of. I mean, I hear all the time about people who either met or had their relationships deepen, or had relationships with their family and friends deepen because of those questions, very similar to what Topaz was doing last night. It's a simple process, but it's not a gimmick. It's a game with integrity where vulnerability is so hard. And when you just meet someone without a plan, usually one person will be more forthcoming and the other person may shrink back. And this made a game out of vulnerability. You had to both answer the questions. You were on equal footing. And it was revolutionary. And it just, people got to know each other very deeply. I don't know what percentage of people fall in love from that, probably very few. But when you're talking about tens and hundreds of millions of people, very few falling in love is a lot. And a lot of people who got married and formed relationships. And when I added that sidebar, it was like half an hour before I had to hit publish. And I thought, people are going to want to know what these questions are. I'm not going to link to this study, like we should just put them, and I consulted a friend who said, well, you can't just republish them, you need to add context. So I wrote a couple of paragraphs. It took me 15 minutes, and then added the questions. And in that snap decision changed millions of lives. And it's kind of awesome that happened as sort of an afterthought, and that was made available. And the person who did the study was thrilled. He was like, oh my God, I never thought this would have such impact. But to have that sort of media leverage, be able to notice something and be able to do something in a very short amount of time and have it put out there in a way that changes lives and makes the world a better place. Poof.
Thank you.
That was great.
Great question. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel, so much for being here today. It's an honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you for bringing Modern Love to Romania. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories. And I encourage you to share more of your vulnerable stories with one another at this festival to build connection. And you're welcome to come chat with us throughout this festival about love, about technology, and anything in between. So thank you all so much.